The June heat of 1851 clung to Savannah Creek like a second skin, thick and unforgiving. The town square buzzed with the usual commerce of a Thursday afternoon, merchants hawking their wares, women in their crinolines seeking shade beneath parasols, and slaves moving silently through the crowds with bundles and baskets. At the center of it all stood the Harrison estate, a white-columned monument to wealth built on cotton, tobacco, and the backs of 300 souls who had no choice but to build it. Clara Harrison stood at her bedroom window on the 3rd floor, watching the activity below with eyes that had long grown tired of seeing the same scenes play out day after day. 23 years old, unmarried despite her father's increasingly desperate attempts to match her with suitable men from Charleston and Atlanta, she'd become something of a curiosity in Savannah Creek. Beautiful, certainly with hair the color of autumn wheat and eyes like Georgia clay after rain, but possessed of a stubborn streak that had sent 3 potential suitors packing within the last year alone. "Miss Clara, your father's asking for you in his study," came the voice of Prudence, one of the house slaves, from behind her door. "Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories." Clara turned from the window, smoothing the ivory fabric of her day dress. "Tell him I'll be down presently." She knew what awaited her. Another lecture about duty, about the family name, about how her refusal to marry was becoming an embarrassment to Mayor Thomas Harrison's political ambitions. Her father had spent 20 years building his influence in Georgia, expanding the Harrison holdings until their name carried weight from Savannah to Augusta. He had not done all of that, he frequently reminded her, to have his only daughter become a spinster. The study smelled of tobacco and leather when she entered. Her father sat behind his massive oak desk, his face ruddy from the heat and from the whiskey he'd been drinking since noon. At 48, Thomas Harrison was still an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with steel-grey hair and eyes that could intimidate a rival or charm a voter with equal facility. "Clara, sit down." His tone left no room for argument. She took the chair opposite him, folding her hands in her lap with practiced composure. "I've received a letter from William Thornton in Charleston," he began, pulling a piece of paper from his desk drawer. "He's still interested, despite your behavior at the Christmas gala." Clara kept her expression neutral. William Thornton was 42, twice widowed, with a plantation reputation built on cruelty and a smile that never reached his eyes. The thought of his hands on her made her skin crawl. "Father, I've told you—" "What you've told me," he interrupted, his voice rising, "is that you're too particular, too refined for the men I've introduced you to. Clara, you're 23 years old. In another year, you'll be past the age where any respectable man will consider you. Then perhaps I'm not meant for a respectable man." The words left her mouth before she could stop them. The silence that followed was deafening. Her father's face darkened to a dangerous shade of crimson. "Get out," he said quietly. "Get out before I say something we'll both regret." Clara rose with as much dignity as she could muster and left the study. In the hallway, she passed her mother, Elizabeth Harrison, who looked at her with a mixture of pity and exasperation. Her mother had long since given up trying to understand her only child, resigning herself instead to afternoon teas and social obligations that kept her busy enough to forget about Clara's rebellion. Outside, the afternoon had grown even hotter. Clara walked through the gardens toward the stables, needing to put distance between herself and the suffocating expectations of the main house. The grounds of the Harrison estate stretched over 5 acres, meticulously maintained by a dozen slaves who worked from dawn until dusk, keeping the gardens pristine, the stables clean, the buildings painted. It was behind the stables, in a separate building that housed the forge, that Clara heard the rhythmic strike of hammer on anvil. The sound drew her forward, though she couldn't have said why. Perhaps it was the regularity of it, the honest labor it represented, so different from the political maneuvering and social climbing that defined her father's world. She approached the open door of the forge and stopped at the threshold. The interior glowed with heat from the furnace, and in that orange light she saw him for the first time. Isaiah was 25 years old, tall and powerfully built from years of working iron. His skin gleamed with sweat as he worked, muscles moving beneath it with practiced precision. He wore only pants, his torso bare against the heat, and his hands, large, scarred hands, shaped metal as if it were clay. But it was his face that stopped Clara's breath. There was intelligence there, and dignity, and something else she couldn't name. When he looked up and met her eyes, she felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. For a long moment, neither spoke. The hammer paused in midair. Around them, the sounds of the estate faded to nothing. "Can I help you, miss?" His voice was deep, careful, trained by necessity to show deference even when every line of his body spoke of independence. Clara found her voice with difficulty. "My horse, Silver. She needs to be shod." It wasn't true. Silver had been shod just 2 weeks ago, but Isaiah only nodded, setting down his hammer with deliberate care. "I'll see to it in the morning, Miss Harrison." "Clara," she said, surprising herself. "My name is Clara." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, wariness, perhaps recognition of the dangerous line she was crossing. In Savannah Creek, in all of Georgia, in 1851, there were rules as rigid as iron about how whites and blacks interacted. Those rules were written in blood and enforced with the lash. For a white woman to invite familiarity with a slave was to court disaster. "Yes, Miss Clara," he said, adding the title as a shield against the intimacy she'd offered. She should have left then, should have turned and walked back to the main house, back to safety and propriety. Instead, she took a step into the forge. "What are you making?" Isaiah hesitated, then held up the piece he'd been working, a decorative gate hinge. The metal twisted into an elegant spiral. For the new chapel in town, Reverend Matthews commissioned it. "It's beautiful," Clara said, and meant it. There was artistry in the work that surprised her. "Where did you learn to do this?" "My father was a blacksmith in Virginia before—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Before he was sold south, separated from his family, his history reduced to a line in a ledger book. Clara moved closer to examine the hinge, aware of the heat from the furnace, the smell of coal and hot metal, and underneath it all, the scent of him, sweat and smoke, and something indefinable that made her heart beat faster. "You have real talent," she said softly. "Thank you, Miss Clara." His formality was a barrier, but she could sense the person behind it, could feel the weight of all the things he couldn't say. She looked up at him, and their eyes met again. This time, the contact lasted long enough for Clara to see past the careful mask he wore, long enough for Isaiah to see that she was looking at him not as property, not as a servant, but as a man. Long enough for both of them to recognize that something irreversible had just begun. "I should go," Clara said, but she didn't move. "Yes, miss," Isaiah agreed, but he didn't look away. The hammer lay forgotten on the anvil. The iron cooled in the air between them, and somewhere in the distance a clock struck 4, marking the moment when everything that would follow became inevitable. When Clara finally left the forge, walking back toward the main house on unsteady legs, she didn't see the figure watching from the stable windows. Silas Drummond, the overseer, had been checking the horses when he'd noticed Miss Harrison enter the forge alone. He'd watched the entire encounter, and now his thin lips curved into a smile that held no warmth. Information was currency in Savannah Creek, and Silas had just acquired something potentially valuable. He would hold on to it, wait for the right moment. After all, Mayor Harrison paid well for loyalty and even better for information about threats to his family's reputation. In the forge, Isaiah returned to his work with hands that shook slightly as he lifted the hammer. He had lived his entire life understanding the rules, knowing that survival meant never forgetting his place, never meeting a white person's eyes for too long, never allowing himself to see what he'd just seen in Clara Harrison's gaze. But he had seen it, and God help them both. She had seen the same thing reflected in his own eyes. The iron hissed when he plunged it into water, steam rising like a warning. That night, Clara lay awake in her bed, unable to shake the memory of Isaiah's eyes, the strength in his hands, the controlled power in every movement. She had been courted by wealthy men, educated men, men who could offer her everything society said she should want. None of them had made her feel what she'd felt in those few minutes in the forge. It was madness. It was dangerous. It was impossible. And yet, as sleep finally claimed her in the early hours of the morning, Clara was already planning when she could return to the forge, already inventing reasons to see him again. In the slave quarters behind the estate, Isaiah lay on his narrow cot, staring at the ceiling. Around him, others slept, men and women exhausted from a day's labor, their rest troubled by dreams of freedom that would likely never come. He thought about Clara Harrison, about the way she'd looked at him, spoken to him. He thought about the life he'd had before, fragments of memory from childhood, his mother's singing, his father teaching him to work the forge, a sister whose name he could barely remember. He thought about the scars on his back from the last time he'd forgotten his place, 3 years ago on a different plantation. The memory of the whip was enough to make him break out in cold sweat. This was dangerous. This was how men died slowly, publicly, as examples to others who might dare to look at a white woman with anything other than servile indifference. But even knowing all of that, even understanding the price that would be exacted if anyone suspected what had passed between them, Isaiah couldn't stop himself from hoping that Clara Harrison would return to the forge tomorrow. In the main house, Mayor Thomas Harrison sat in his study, reviewing accounts and correspondence. He was planning his campaign for state senate, consolidating alliances, calling in favors. The Harrison name would go farther than Savannah Creek, he was determined. His legacy would be written in Georgia's history books. He had no idea that his legacy was already being written in sparks and stolen glances, in a language older and more powerful than politics. The clock struck midnight. Outside, heat lightning flickered on the horizon, promising storms. In the forge, in the dying light of the furnace, the decorative hinge Isaiah had been making lay cooling on the workbench. The spiral pattern caught the faint glow, looking almost like two paths intertwining, binding together in a way that could never be undone. Chapter 2. Dawn broke humid and grey over Savannah Creek, the sky promising rain that wouldn't fall until evening. Clara woke before her mother's usual morning call, dressed quickly in a simple day dress of pale blue cotton, and made her way downstairs while the house still slept in relative quiet. She had no plan, no clear intention beyond the pull that had kept her awake most of the night, the need to see him again, to confirm that what she'd felt yesterday had been real. The kitchen was already alive with activity when she passed through. Mamie, the head cook, looked up in surprise from the dough she was kneading. "Miss Clara, you're up early. Can I fix you something?" "Just some coffee, Mamie. I'm going to check on Silver." Mamie's weathered face creased with concern. "Horse still giving you trouble?" Clara had forgotten her lie from yesterday about the shoeing. "Just want to make sure she's settling well," she improvised, accepting the cup of strong black coffee Mamie poured for her. The walk to the stables seemed longer in the morning light, more exposed. Clara was acutely aware that anyone looking from the house would see her, would wonder what she was doing, but the estate was vast enough, and her movements within it common enough that she could claim innocence if questioned. She was checking on her horse, nothing more. The forge stood silent when she approached, its door closed against the morning damp. Clara felt a spike of disappointment. Perhaps Isaiah worked later in the day. Perhaps she'd have to invent another reason to return. But as she drew closer, she heard movement inside, the soft scrape of metal on stone. She knocked softly, conscious of how the sound might carry. The door opened, and Isaiah stood there, surprise evident on his face before he schooled it into careful neutrality. He'd clearly been working for some time already. His shirt was streaked with coal dust, his hands dark with it. "Miss Clara." He glanced past her toward the main house, checking for observers. "Is something wrong with your horse?" "No, She faltered, realizing how foolish she must seem, how transparent her excuse had been. "I wanted to see the hinge you were working on yesterday, the one for the chapel." It was a weak pretext, and they both knew it. But Isaiah stepped back, allowing her into the forge. The space felt smaller this morning, more intimate, the air between them charged with everything they couldn't say. The hinge lay on the workbench where he'd left it, now complete. Clara moved to examine it, genuinely impressed by the craftsmanship. The spiral pattern was even more intricate than she'd realized, each curve flowing naturally into the next. "It's remarkable," she said softly. "You're an artist." "I'm a blacksmith, Miss Clara." "Artists get to choose what they make." The bitterness in his voice was subtle but unmistakable. Clara looked up at him, seeing the tension in his jaw, the way he held himself rigid against the danger of this moment. "I shouldn't be here," she said. "No, miss, you shouldn't." But neither of them moved. The morning light filtered through the open door, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air between them. Somewhere outside, a mockingbird sang its complicated song. "Why did you come back?" Isaiah asked, and there was something raw in the question, something that stripped away the careful formality he maintained. Clara met his eyes. "Because I couldn't stay away." The honesty of it hung in the air like smoke. Isaiah closed his eyes briefly, as if in pain. "You don't know what you're risking," he said. "If anyone saw you come here twice, if anyone suspected, I know the risks." "No, Miss Clara, you don't." His voice was urgent now, low and intense. "You know what might happen to you, scandal, shame, being sent away. But do you know what would happen to me? Do you understand that they would make an example of me, that I would die slowly enough for every slave in 3 counties to hear about it?" The brutality of his words made Clara flinch, but she didn't look away. "Then tell me to leave. Tell me not to come back." Isaiah stared at her, and in his eyes, Clara saw a war being fought, duty against desire, survival instinct against something deeper. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I can't." Those 2 words changed everything. They were an acknowledgement, a surrender, a point of no return. Clara felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she took a step closer to him. "Then what do we do?" she asked. "Nothing. We do nothing. You go back to the main house, and I finish this hinge, and we both forget this conversation ever happened." "Can you do that? Forget?" Isaiah's jaw clenched. "I've forgotten plenty in my life, Miss Clara, things I had to forget to survive." "I don't believe you." Clara's voice was gentle but firm. "I don't believe you can forget any more than I can." For a long moment, Isaiah said nothing. Then, with deliberate slowness, he reached out and touched her hand, just the lightest brush of his fingers against hers, a contact that lasted no more than a heartbeat before he pulled away. But it was enough. Enough to confirm what they both already knew. "This is madness," he said. "Yes, it will end badly, probably." "Then why—" He stopped, shaking his head. "I have nothing to offer you, Miss Clara, nothing but misery and danger. Your world and mine, they're not meant to touch." "They already are touching," Clara said. "What do you think is happening right now?" Before Isaiah could respond, they heard footsteps approaching outside, heavy boots on gravel, accompanied by whistling. They sprang apart, like startled deer. Clara moved quickly toward the workbench, pretending to examine tools, while Isaiah turned to the furnace, beginning to stoke it to life. Silas Drummond appeared in the doorway, his pale eyes taking in the scene with sharp intelligence. He was a lean man, all angles and edges, with thinning brown hair and a face that seemed permanently set in suspicion. He'd been overseer on the Harrison estate for 5 years, and he ran it with methodical efficiency and casual cruelty. "Miss Harrison," he said, touching his hat brim. "Didn't expect to see you out here this early." Clara forced herself to meet his gaze with the confidence of someone who had nothing to hide. "My horse needs attention. I was checking with Isaiah about when he could see to her." Silas's eyes moved from Clara to Isaiah and back again. "Horse seems fine to me. Saw her in the paddock yesterday evening, moving sound." "The left rear shoe is loose," Clara said smoothly. "I noticed it day before yesterday." It was a calculated risk. Silas might check, might discover the lie, but Clara was betting that he wouldn't bother, that a loose shoe was mundane enough to be believed. Silas nodded slowly. "Well, Isaiah here can handle it after he finishes the chapel commission. That's due to Reverend Matthews by tomorrow, isn't it, boy?" "Yes, sir," Isaiah said, his voice carefully neutral. "Then Miss Harrison can wait until tomorrow afternoon for her horse." Silas smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Unless it's urgent enough to interrupt paying work? It was a challenge, subtle but unmistakable. Clara recognized it for what it was, a power play, a reminder of who held authority here. "Tomorrow afternoon will be fine," Clara said. "Thank you, Silas." She left the forge without looking back at Isaiah, aware of Silas's eyes following her all the way back to the main house. Her hands were shaking slightly, but she kept her pace measured, unhurried, giving no sign of distress. In the forge, Silas turned to Isaiah with a smile that was more like a baring of teeth. "You want to be careful there, boy," he said conversationally. "Miss Clara's a curious thing, always wandering about. But curiosity can be dangerous, for everyone involved." Isaiah kept his eyes on the furnace. "Yes, sir. Good. Long as we understand each other." Silas lingered a moment more, then left, whistling the same tuneless melody. Isaiah stood alone in the forge, his heart pounding. Silas knew. Maybe not everything, but enough to be watching now, enough to be dangerous. The smart thing would be to avoid Clara completely from here on out, to rebuild the walls of servile indifference that had kept him safe for 25 years. But when he closed his eyes, he could still feel the ghost of her hand under his, could still see the way she'd looked at him with those eyes that saw him as a man, not as property. The forge suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. Isaiah stepped outside, needing space to think. The morning had fully broken now, the sky lightening to pale grey. In a few hours, the estate would be fully awake, and he would return to the familiar rhythm of his work hammer and anvil, fire and iron, the steady progression of labor that marked his days. But something had broken in that rhythm, some fundamental pattern disrupted, and Isaiah had lived long enough to know that once certain things were set in motion, they couldn't be stopped. They could only be survived if you were lucky. If you were very, very lucky. In the main house, Clara reached her room without encountering anyone else. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it, trying to calm her racing heart. The brief touch of Isaiah's hand had sent electricity through her entire body, a sensation she'd never experienced with any of the men her father had paraded before her. She moved to her writing desk and sat down, pulling out a sheet of paper. She had no plan to send him a letter that would be monumentally foolish, creating evidence that could destroy them both. But she needed to process what was happening, needed to see it written down to believe it was real. "I have met someone," she wrote, then stopped. How could she possibly explain this to anyone, even in a private journal that no one would read? How could she describe the feeling of recognition she'd experienced in the forge, as if she'd been waiting her entire life for this moment? She set down the pen and pressed her palms against her eyes. This was impossible, not just difficult or scandalous, but genuinely impossible. Even if by some miracle they could overcome every social barrier between them, Isaiah was still legally property, her father's property. The very thought made her sick. A knock at her door made her jump. She quickly folded the paper and tucked it into the desk drawer before calling out, "Come in." Her mother entered, already dressed for the day, in a morning gown of lavender silk. Elizabeth Harrison looked tired, as she always did these days, worn down by years of maintaining appearances and managing a household of servants and slaves. "Clara, your father wants to speak with you after breakfast. He has news about Mr. Thornton." Clara's stomach sank. "What kind of news?" "He'll tell you himself. Please, darling, try to be receptive. Your father's patience is wearing thin." After her mother left, Clara sat staring at the closed door. The walls of her world seemed to be closing in, the future her father had planned for her becoming inescapable. Unless she found another way out, unless she was willing to risk everything. In the kitchen, Mamie was directing the preparation of breakfast when Prudence came in from the slave quarters with news that spread through the household staff like wildfire. "Ruby's dead," Prudence said quietly. "Found her this morning." Heart gave out in her sleep. Ruby had been 63, ancient by the standards of enslaved people on southern plantations. She'd worked in the Harrison household since before Clara was born, first as a field hand, then in the house after age and arthritis made outdoor labor impossible. "Lord have mercy," Mamie breathed, making the sign of the cross. She was a good woman, deserved better than she got. It was as close as anyone dared come to criticism of the system that had worked Ruby literally to death. In the quarters, her passing would be mourned tonight with quiet songs and prayers. In the main house, she would barely be noticed, just another entry in the ledger, a piece of property that had depreciated to zero value. Isaiah heard the news from Moses, one of the stable hands, while he was working. Ruby had been kind to him when he first arrived at the Harrison estate 3 years ago, sold south from a Virginia plantation after its owner died. She'd given him advice on how to navigate the particular dangers of this household, how to avoid Silas's temper and the mayor's attention. He set down his hammer and stood for a moment in silence, honoring her memory in the only way available to him. Another life finished, another story ended without ever being told. The chapel hinge lay completed on his workbench, ready for delivery tomorrow. It was good work, perhaps the best he'd ever done. For a moment, Isaiah allowed himself to imagine a different life, one where his skill with metal could earn him recognition, respect, maybe even freedom. But that was fantasy. In the real world, even the most talented slave was still just property, his work credited to his owner, his gifts exploited for someone else's profit. The morning stretched toward noon, thick with humidity and unspoken tension. Throughout the Harrison estate, people went about their daily routines, unaware that the bonds holding their world together had already begun to fray. Some threads can only be pulled so tight before they snap, and in the forge behind the stables, in the manor house where Clara waited for another ultimatum from her father, in the overseer's quarters where Silas Drummond made careful notes in his daily log, those threads were stretching to their breaking point. By evening, when the promised rain finally came, it would wash away the dust of the day, but nothing else. The momentum had already begun, set in motion by something as simple and as complicated as two people seeing each other clearly for the first time. In a world built on not seeing, on willful blindness to humanity and suffering, such clarity was revolutionary. And revolution, once started, cannot be easily stopped. Chapter 3. The rain came that evening as promised, drumming against the windows of the Harrison Manor with insistent fingers. Clara sat at the dinner table pushing food around her plate, while her father droned on about William Thornton's latest letter. Across from her, her mother ate in silence, occasionally glancing between husband and daughter with worried eyes. "He's willing to overlook your previous indiscretion at the Christmas gala," Mayor Harrison was saying, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who'd successfully negotiated a difficult deal. "In fact, he's quite eager to proceed with a formal courtship. I've invited him to visit next month." Clara set down her fork with more force than necessary. "And what if I'm not eager, Father?" The table fell silent except for the rain. Mayor Harrison's face darkened, but he kept his voice controlled. What you're eager for is irrelevant, Clara. You've had 3 years to make a suitable match on your own terms. That time has passed. So now I'm to be sold off. Like, she stopped herself, but not soon enough. Like what? Her father's voice was dangerously quiet. Clara met his eyes, seeing in them the implacable will that had built the Harrison fortune, that had crushed rivals and accumulated power through 3 decades of calculated moves. She was just another piece on his chessboard, another asset to be deployed strategically, like property. She finished quietly. Her mother gasped. Mayor Harrison stood up abruptly, his napkin falling to the floor. "You will apologize for that comparison, now." But Clara stood as well, her own anger finally breaking through years of careful restraint. "Why should I apologize for speaking the truth? You've arranged my entire life without once asking what I wanted. My education, my friends, my future, all decided for your political advantage. The only difference between me and the people you own outright is that I can't be sold at auction, though apparently I can be traded for political alliance." "Clara!" Her mother's voice was sharp with fear. Mayor Harrison's face had gone from red to white, a vein pulsing visibly in his temple. When he spoke, each word was carved from ice. "Go to your room, now. And you will stay there until you're ready to behave like the daughter I raised and not some hysterical child." Clara wanted to say more, wanted to unleash all the frustration and rage that had been building for years. But she recognized the look in her father's eyes. He was beyond reason now, operating on pure authoritarian reflex. Anything else she said would only make things worse. She left the dining room with what dignity she could muster, aware of the servants' eyes following her, aware that this confrontation would be discussed in the slave quarters tonight. Another piece of white family drama for them to pass and analyze for what it might mean for their own survival. In her room, Clara locked the door and moved to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. Outside, lightning flickered across the sky, illuminating the grounds in brief, stark flashes. She could just make out the forge in the distance, dark and silent. What was she doing? What was she risking everything for? A few stolen moments with a man she barely knew, a connection that had no future, no possibility of fulfillment. It was madness, just as Isaiah had said, but even thinking his name sent a warmth through her that defied logic. She'd spent 23 years being the dutiful daughter, following the rules, accepting the limitations of her gender and class, and what had it gotten her? A parade of arrogant suitors, a father who saw her as currency, and a future stretching ahead like a prison sentence. Clara pulled paper from her desk drawer and began to write, not caring any more about caution or discretion. The words poured out of her everything she'd felt in the forge, everything she'd been too afraid to say to Isaiah directly, everything she couldn't tell anyone else in her constricted, suffocating world. She wrote for an hour, filling page after page, until her hand cramped and the rain had slowed to a gentle patter. Then she read what she'd written, and slowly, deliberately, she tore each page into small pieces and burned them one by one in the fireplace, watching the paper curl and blacken, carrying her dangerous words up the chimney in smoke. Some things were too dangerous to exist, even in writing. In the forge, Isaiah worked late into the night, unable to sleep despite his exhaustion. He was making something new, something not commissioned, letting his hands move instinctively while his mind churned through impossible scenarios. He was fashioning a bird from scraps of iron wings spread wide in flight, head thrown back as if singing. It was delicate work, requiring precision and patience, and it kept him from thinking about Clara Harrison, about the disaster he could feel approaching like a summer storm. But eventually, even concentration couldn't hold back the thoughts. He set down his tools and stared at the iron bird, this thing of beauty he'd created that would never truly fly, could never escape the weight of the metal it was made from. The analogy wasn't lost on him. The rain had stopped by the time Silas Drummond made his evening rounds, checking that all the slaves were accounted for in their quarters. He paused outside the forge, noting the light still burning within, then continued on his circuit. He was a patient man. He'd learned long ago that the best way to catch someone breaking rules was to let them think they'd gotten away with it first. Let them grow confident, careless, then strike. He'd seen the way Isaiah looked at Miss Clara, that brief moment in the forge before they'd noticed his presence. He'd seen the way she'd looked back. It was barely anything, just a glance, really. But Silas had spent years watching for exactly such things. Enslaved people who forgot their place. White people who forgot why that place existed. In his room in the overseer's house, he opened his logbook and made a careful entry. June 16th, 1851. Isaiah, Forge, and Miss C. Harrison. Second meeting observed. Recommend continued surveillance. He dated and signed the entry with satisfaction. Whatever was developing here, he would document it thoroughly. And when the time came to report it to Mayor Harrison, he would have evidence, not just suspicion. The thought of the reward that would surely follow made him smile in the darkness. The next day dawned clear and warm, the rain having washed away the humidity, but not the tension that hung over the Harrison estate like a pall. Clara remained in her room, claiming illness, when Prudence knocked to bring breakfast. In truth, she was making plans, thinking through options, trying to see a path forward that didn't end in catastrophe. By noon, she'd made a decision. Reckless, dangerous, but the only one she could live with. She would go to the forge one more time. She would tell Isaiah how she felt, consequences be damned, and then she would either accept her father's plans for her future, or she would find another way out, even if that meant running away, leaving everything behind. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. That afternoon, while Clara was dressing to go downstairs, Prudence rushed into her room without knocking, her eyes wide with fear. "Miss Clara, you need to stay in your room. Your father's in a fury." "What's happened?" "It's Ruby's funeral. Isaiah, Miss Clara, he spoke up at the service, said things about justice and dignity and, oh Lord, Miss Clara, Silas heard about it and went straight to your father." Clara's blood ran cold. What kind of things did he say? Just that Ruby deserved to be remembered as more than property, that she had a name, a soul, that she mattered. Prudence was wringing her hands. But the way he said it, Miss Clara, it was like he was challenging the whole system. And you know how your father feels about slaves who get ideas. Clara pushed past Prudence and ran down the stairs, heedless of propriety. She reached the front hallway just as her father was heading out the door with Silas and two other white men from town, Jonas Bradley and Samuel Pike, both known for their hardline views on slave discipline. "Father, wait!" Mayor Harrison turned, his face like granite. "Get back to your room, Clara. This doesn't concern you. What are you going to do? What needs to be done? A slave who speaks out against his betters needs to be reminded of his place before his ideas spread to others. He was just honoring a dead woman. There's no crime in that." Her father's eyes narrowed. "And how would you know what he was doing? Were you at the slave funeral, Clara?" She realized her mistake too late. "No, Prudence told me, get to your room." Each word was a hammer blow. "And stay there until I return." They left, the four men striding purposefully toward the slave quarters. Clara stood frozen in the hallway, her mind racing. She had to do something, had to warn Isaiah, had to Miss Clara. Prudence's voice was soft, urgent. "Don't. Whatever you're thinking, don't. You'll only make it worse for him." "How could it be worse?" Clara's voice broke. "Prudence, they're going to hurt him because he dared to speak the truth." "They're going to hurt him because that's what they do," Prudence said, her voice heavy with the weight of experience. "And if you interfere, they'll hurt him more. They'll make an example of him. The only thing you can do for him now is stay away." But Clara was already moving toward the back door, driven by something beyond reason or caution. She had to see him, had to at least let him know that someone bore witness, that his words hadn't gone unheard. She made it as far as the garden before her mother intercepted her, moving with surprising speed for a woman usually so languid. "Clara, stop." Elizabeth Harrison grabbed her daughter's arm. I know what you're feeling. But you cannot go out there. If your father sees you anywhere near the slave quarters right now, if he even suspects—" "Suspects what, Mother?" Clara wrenched her arm free. "What exactly do you think you know?" Her mother's face was filled with a sadness Clara had never seen before. "I know that look in your eyes. I've seen it before, many years ago. I know what it means to feel trapped, to see a way out that everyone else calls madness." She cupped Clara's face gently. "But I also know what happens to women who choose that path. And I know what happens to the men they choose. Please, Clara, please don't do this." "What happened to you?" Clara whispered. "Who was he?" But her mother just shook her head, tears sliding down her cheeks. "It doesn't matter. He's long dead and I'm still here. And that's all you need to know. Stay in the house, Clara. If you care about that man at all, stay away from him." In the forge, Isaiah was working when they came for him. He'd heard them approaching, their boots, their voices, the particular energy that preceded violence. He set down his tools carefully, with the deliberate precision of a man who knows his world is about to shatter and wants to preserve what dignity he can. Mayor Harrison entered first, flanked by Silas and the others. Isaiah kept his eyes down, but his jaw was set firm. "You've got a bold tongue, boy," the mayor said, "talking about justice and dignity, as if you'd know anything about either." Isaiah said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make this worse. "Strip off your shirt." Isaiah's hands trembled slightly as he obeyed. He'd been whipped before, had the scars to prove it, but knowing what was coming didn't make it easier. They tied his hands to one of the forge's support beams, stretching his arms above his head. Silas produced the whip with obvious satisfaction, a leather strap designed to maximize pain while minimizing permanent damage. Couldn't have slaves dying from discipline after all. They were too valuable for that. 10 lashes, Mayor Harrison announced, to remind you and everyone else what happens when you forget your place. The first strike landed with a crack that echoed through the forge. Isaiah's body jerked, but he didn't cry out. The second followed, then the third. By the 5th, his back was on fire. By the 8th, he felt warm blood running down his spine, but he didn't scream, didn't beg, didn't give them the satisfaction. When it was over, they cut him down. He collapsed to his knees, his vision swimming. "Clean yourself up," Mayor Harrison said, "and if I hear another word out of you about justice or dignity or anything else beyond yes, sir, and no, sir, the next punishment will be considerably worse. Understand?" "Yes, sir," Isaiah forced out through gritted teeth. They left him there, bleeding on the forge floor. After a few minutes, Moses appeared with clean water and cloth. Together with 2 other men from the quarters, he helped Isaiah back to his cabin, where they cleaned and dressed his wounds as best they could. "Brother, what were you thinking?" Moses whispered as he worked. "You know better than to speak up like that." Isaiah's laugh was bitter and sharp. "I was thinking that Ruby deserved better than to be forgotten, that maybe if just one person spoke the truth about what she suffered, about what we all suffer, maybe it would matter." "And did it matter?" Isaiah closed his eyes, feeling the pain radiating through his body, knowing that Clara would hear about this, that she would blame herself, that the small connection they'd formed was now contaminated by violence. "No," he admitted, "it didn't matter at all." But later that night, when the worst of the pain had subsided enough for him to think clearly, Isaiah realized that wasn't quite true. It had mattered to him. For one brief moment, he'd spoken his truth, had claimed his humanity in the face of a system designed to strip it away. And that had to count for something, even if only to himself. In her locked room, Clara heard the story from Prudence, who'd heard it from Mamie, who'd heard it from Moses. 10 lashes for speaking Ruby's name with respect, 10 lashes for asserting his humanity. Clara pressed her face against her pillow and wept, silently, so her father wouldn't hear. She wept for Isaiah's pain, for Ruby's wasted life, for the mother's lost love, for the future that was slipping away from her with every passing hour. But underneath the grief, something else was growing. Not just love, though she recognized now that was what she felt, but rage, pure, clear rage at the system that had hurt Isaiah, that would hurt him again, that hurt countless others every single day and called it normal, natural, the way things had always been and always would be. By morning, Clara's tears had dried. In their place was a cold determination. If the world wouldn't change, if the rules couldn't be broken, then she would have to break them herself. Whatever it took, whatever it cost, she would not let Isaiah's courage be for nothing. She would find a way to make it matter. Outside, the sun rose on another day in Savannah Creek, Georgia. The forge remained cold and dark, its blacksmith too injured to work. The Harrison household went about its business with the smooth efficiency of a well-oiled machine, and in the careful ledger books where Silas Drummond recorded the daily operations of the estate, a new entry appeared, June 17, 1851. Isaiah, forge, disciplined for insubordination. Work capability reduced for 3 to 5 days. Recommend watching for further infractions. Everything was as it should be. Everything was under control, except that it wasn't. The spark that had ignited between Clara Harrison and Isaiah had been fanned by pain and injustice into something larger, something that would soon burn beyond anyone's ability to contain it. In the ruins of what would one day be, people would point to this moment to a funeral speech and a whipping, to a woman's tears and a man's refusal to break and say, this was where it started. This was the beginning of the end for the Harrison dynasty. But for now, in the early morning light of June 18th, 1851, no one knew that yet. They would learn soon enough. Chapter 4. 3 days passed before Isaiah could return to work. 3 days during which his back healed in angry welts, and Clara paced her room like a caged animal. Her father had lifted her confinement, but the unspoken understanding was clear. She was being watched. Prudence, Mamie, even her own mother, all of them monitoring her movements, reporting back to the mayor. But surveillance only worked if the prisoner cared about being caught. On the evening of the 3rd day, Clara waited until the house settled into its pre-dinner routine. Her father was in his study with Samuel Pike, discussing county politics. Her mother was resting in her room with one of her frequent headaches. The servants were occupied with meal preparations. It was a 15-minute window, no more, but it would have to be enough. She slipped out through the kitchen gardens, moving quickly but not running. Running would draw attention. The setting sun cast long shadows across the grounds as she approached the forge. Through the open door, she could see Isaiah at the anvil, moving slowly, carefully, each motion clearly causing pain. She didn't call out, didn't knock. She simply stepped inside and closed the door behind her. Isaiah looked up, and his eyes widened with alarm. "Miss Clara, you can't be here." "If they see, let them see." Clara's voice was fierce, unfamiliar even to herself. "I'm tired of hiding, tired of pretending. You're going to get us both killed." But he didn't tell her to leave, didn't move away when she crossed the space between them. In the fading light, Clara could see the lines of pain etched into his face, the careful way he held himself to avoid jarring his injuries. Without thinking, she reached up to touch his cheek, and this time he didn't pull away. "They hurt you because of me," she said softly. "They hurt me because of what I said, because I dared to suggest that Ruby, that any of us deserved basic human dignity." His hand came up to cover hers, where it rested against his face. "You weren't responsible for that, Clara." It was the first time he'd said her name without the title, and the sound of it on his lips made her heart ache. "But I am part of this system," she said. "My comfort, my education, my entire life, all of it built on your suffering, on Ruby's suffering. How do I live with that?" "The same way I live with it," Isaiah said. "By surviving. By finding small moments of beauty where we can. By not letting them take everything." "Is that what this is? Clara asked, her eyes searching his. A small moment of beauty. Isaiah's hand tightened on hers. You know it's more than that. 3. The forge seemed to shrink around them, the world outside fading to nothing. Clara was aware of his heartbeat, rapid under her palm, when she moved her hand to his chest. She was aware of the heat from his body, the way his breathing had changed, the way he was looking at her like she was water, and he was dying of thirst. Then tell me, she whispered. Tell me what you're thinking, what you're feeling. No more hiding behind propriety. For a long moment, Isaiah struggled with himself. Then, as if a dam had broken, the words poured out. I'm thinking that from the moment you walked into this forge, you've been the only thing I can think about. I'm feeling things I have no right to feel for a woman like you. I know it's impossible. I know every reason why this can't happen, but God help me, Clara. When I'm near you, none of those reasons matter. Clara's breath caught. Say my name again. Clara. His voice was rough with emotion. Clara. She rose on her toes and kissed him, and if the world had ended in that moment, she wouldn't have cared. His lips were warm against hers, tentative at first, then deepening as he pulled her closer, despite the pain it must have caused his injured back. The kiss tasted like smoke and danger and freedom, like every rule they were breaking, crystallized into a single moment of perfect clarity. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Isaiah rested his forehead against hers. We can't do this, he said, but he didn't let her go. I know. They'll kill me if they find out. I know. And they'll destroy you. Your reputation, your family, your future, all of it gone. I don't care. And Clara realized it was true. She didn't care about any of it anymore. Isaiah, my father is planning to force me into marriage with William Thornton. Do you know what kind of man he is? Isaiah's jaw clenched. I've heard stories about how he treats the people he owns. Then you understand that I can't go through with it. I won't. I'd rather die than belong to a man like that. So what are you saying? Isaiah pulled back to look at her. What are you suggesting? Clara took a deep breath, voicing the plan that had been forming in her mind over the past 3 days. I'm saying we run, together. There are routes north, aren't there? Underground paths that escaped slaves take? We could use them. Get to Pennsylvania, or further. Somewhere we could be free. Isaiah stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. Clara, do you understand what you're proposing? The risks, the hardships? You're talking about leaving everything you've ever known, about walking away from wealth and comfort, about a journey where we might die or be caught or... I understand all of that, Clara interrupted, but staying here means dying in a different way. Slowly, over years, watching you from a distance, while I'm trapped in a loveless marriage, both of us suffering because we were too afraid to choose something different. Is that really better than taking a chance at freedom? Isaiah shook his head, but she could see the hope starting to kindle in his eyes, dangerous and bright. It's madness. Maybe. Clara smiled slightly. But you said yourself that from the moment we met, this was inevitable. So why not see it through? Why not find out what could happen if we're brave enough to try? When? The question came out raw, half disbelieving. When would we even so soon? Before Thornton arrives next month, before my father can force my hand. Clara pulled a small leather pouch from her pocket. I've been saving money. It's not much, but it's a start. And I know where my mother keeps her jewelry. We'd have enough to get us started once we reach free territory. Isaiah looked at the pouch, then back at Clara's face, seeing the determination there, the reckless courage that both terrified and amazed him. His entire life had been about caution, about survival through submission, and here was this woman proposing they throw caution to the wind and gamble everything on a desperate chance. It was insane. It would probably end in disaster. They would likely be caught, and the consequences would be worse than death. But the alternative was living the rest of their lives wondering what might have been, living with the memory of this moment, this kiss, this brief taste of what freedom could feel like. I need to think about it, he finally said. "This isn't just about us, Clara. If we run and get caught, they'll take it out on everyone in the quarters. Increase security, random punishments, making examples of people to prevent others from getting ideas. I can't be responsible for that." Clara nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what he was saying. "How long do you need?" "A few days, maybe a week, to make sure that if we do this, we do it right." Isaiah hesitated, then added, "And to say goodbye. There are people here, Moses and his family, old Samuel, who taught me more about metalwork when I first arrived. I can't just disappear without giving them some warning, some chance to distance themselves from me before we go." "Then we'll wait," Clara said. "But Isaiah, not too long. My father's pressure is increasing every day. He's desperate to arrange the marriage before the fall campaign season starts. Time isn't on our side." A sound outside made them both freeze. Footsteps, voices. They sprang apart just as the forge door swung open, and Silas Drummond stood silhouetted against the dying sunlight, his pale eyes taking in the scene with predatory satisfaction. "Well, well," he said softly. "What have we here?" Clara's mind raced. They'd been standing apart when he entered, but how long had he been outside? What had he seen or heard? "I was checking on Isaiah's progress," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Father wants to know when the chapel commission will be delivered." "Is that so?" Silas stepped fully into the forge, his gaze moving between them like a spider selecting which fly to wrap first. "Funny, I could have sworn I heard voices. Like maybe you were having a conversation. A private conversation." "Isaiah was explaining the metalwork techniques he uses," Clara improvised. "I was curious about the craftsmanship." "Curious?" Silas smiled, and there was nothing pleasant in it. "Miss Clara, you seem to be mighty curious about this particular slave. This is the 4th time I've seen you at this forge in the past week. Some might think that's odd behavior for a lady of your station." The threat in his words was unmistakable. Clara met his gaze directly, channeling every ounce of aristocratic hauteur she possessed. "What I do on my father's estate is none of your concern, Silas. You forget yourself." For a moment, real anger flashed across Silas's face, but he controlled it, settling back into his usual watchful menace. "Begging your pardon, Miss Clara, but your father hired me to keep order on this estate. Part of that job is reporting anything unusual. And I'd say a young lady spending excessive time alone with a male slave qualifies as unusual. Your father would certainly think so." It was a direct challenge, a line drawn in the dirt. Clara could retreat now, could use her social position to crush this impudent overseer, could deny everything and hope her father believed her over his employee. But all of that would be playing by the old rules, the safe rules, the rules that had governed her entire life. Clara Harrison was done playing by those rules. "Then report it," she said calmly. "Tell my father everything you've seen, but be certain of your facts, Silas. Because if you're wrong, if you're accusing me of improper behavior based on nothing but speculation, my father won't take kindly to it, and you'll be the one looking for new employment." It was a calculated gamble. Mayor Harrison's pride and political ambitions meant he would be furious at any scandal, but he would also be furious at an overseer who made false accusations against his daughter. Clara was betting that Silas didn't actually have enough evidence yet to make his case that he'd been fishing, hoping to provoke a confession or catch them in something undeniable. Silas's eyes narrowed, but she saw the uncertainty there. He wasn't quite ready to play his hand. Not yet. "I'm just doing my job, Miss Clara," he said finally, "keeping watch over things, making sure nothing unfortunate happens." "Then I suggest you watch more carefully," Clara said coldly. "And in the future, perhaps knock before entering buildings where ladies might be present. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to prepare for dinner." She walked past him with her head high, not looking back at Isaiah, not giving Silas any more ammunition. But her heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. She'd bought them time, but not much. Silas knew something was happening, even if he couldn't prove it yet. He would be watching them even more closely now, waiting for a mistake, and when it came, he would strike. They needed to run, and soon. In the forge, after Clara had gone, Silas turned to Isaiah with an expression of cold satisfaction. "You're playing a dangerous game, boy," he said quietly, "and we both know how it ends. The only question is when. I suggest you use whatever time you have left to make your peace with God. You're going to need it." He left Isaiah standing there, the threat hanging in the air like smoke. Isaiah's hands were shaking from fear, from rage, from the impossibility of the situation. Everything Clara had said made sense. Running was the only option now. Staying would mean watching helplessly as Silas built his case, as the walls closed in, as their brief chance at happiness was crushed under the weight of a system designed to prevent exactly what they were attempting. But running meant accepting that their love, and he recognized it now as love, undeniable and absolute, would be built on loss. That others would suffer for their choice, that they might not survive the attempt. Moses found him still standing there an hour later, staring at nothing. "Brother," Moses said gently, "what's happened?" Isaiah looked at his friend, this man who'd been like a brother to him for the past 3 years, and made a decision. "I need to tell you something," he said. "But you need to promise me that whatever I say, you'll protect yourself first. Distance yourself from me. Deny knowing anything if they ask." Moses's expression grew serious. "Tell me." So Isaiah did. He told him everything about Clara, about their feelings for each other, about the plan to run north. He told him about Silas's suspicions, about the closing trap, about the impossible choice between love and survival. When he finished, Moses was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "How can I help?" "Moses, did you not hear what I just said? You need to stay away from me if we get caught." "How can I help?" Moses repeated firmly. "You think you're the first person in the quarters to dream of running? You think you're the first to look at the North Star and wonder if you had the courage to follow it?" He gripped Isaiah's shoulder. "Brother, if you have a chance at freedom, a real chance, then you take it, and the rest of us will do what we can to help you get there." Isaiah felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I can't ask you to risk. You're not asking. I'm offering. Now you got a timeline? You got a plan?" For the next hour, they talked in low voices, working out details. Moses knew people. There was a network, carefully hidden, of sympathizers who helped escaped slaves move north. A white woman willing to help would make Isaiah's journey easier, less suspicious. If they could reach the first safe house, about 60 miles north in the mountain country, they'd have a chance. The risks were enormous. Slave catchers, dogs, rough terrain, exposure, starvation, any number of things could kill them before they reached free territory. But staying meant certain destruction, just of a different, slower kind. 2 weeks, Isaiah finally said. "Give me 2 weeks to prepare, to build up supplies, to make sure everything's in place. Then we run." 2 weeks, Moses agreed. "I'll put out quiet word. Get you whatever help I can without raising suspicion." They clasped hands in the gathering darkness, brothers in all but blood, united by a dream of freedom that had been deferred too long. In the main house, Clara sat through dinner in a daze, barely tasting the food, barely hearing her father's conversation with Samuel Pike about cotton prices and tariff policies. Her mind was racing through scenarios, through possibilities, through the 1,000 things that could go wrong with their plan. Under the table, her hands twisted in her lap. In 2 weeks, if everything went according to plan, she would be gone from this house forever. Everything she'd known, everyone she'd grown up with, all of it left behind for an uncertain future with a man she'd known for less than a month. It should have terrified her. Part of her was terrified, but a larger part felt something else entirely, relief, as if she'd been holding her breath her entire life and was finally allowed to breathe. "Clara, are you listening?" Her father's voice cut through her reverie. "I'm sorry, Father, what did you say?" Mayor Harrison frowned at her. "I said that William Thornton has moved up his visit. He'll be arriving next Friday instead of next month. Apparently he's eager to finalize the arrangement." Clara's blood ran cold. Next Friday. That was 8 days away. 8 days until she'd be trapped into an engagement with a man she despised, until her father would consider the matter settled and increase his vigilance against any attempt to escape. They couldn't wait 2 weeks anymore. They had to move faster. "How wonderful," she managed to say. "I look forward to seeing him again." The lie tasted like ash in her mouth, but her father seemed satisfied. He returned to his conversation with Pike, oblivious to his daughter's panic. After dinner, Clara excused herself and went to her room. She pulled out paper and wrote quickly, "Friday is too soon. We need to move earlier. Is 4 days enough?" She would find a way to get the message to Isaiah tomorrow. They would have to accelerate everything, take bigger risks, hope that speed would compensate for lack of preparation. But they no longer had the luxury of waiting. Thornton's early arrival changed everything. Clara folded the note carefully and hid it in her bodice, then moved to her window. Outside, the night was thick with clouds, obscuring the moon and stars. In the darkness, she couldn't see the forge, couldn't see anything beyond her own faint reflection in the glass. But somewhere out there, Isaiah was making the same calculations, coming to the same conclusions. They were running out of time. The clock in the hallway struck 10. Clara counted the chimes, each one bringing her closer to Friday, closer to William Thornton and the life sentence he represented. Unless she and Isaiah could outrun it. 4 days. They had 4 days to plan an escape, gather supplies, and risk everything on a desperate gamble for freedom. 4 days to change the course of 2 lives, to strike a blow against a system that had crushed thousands before them. 4 days until the fire that had been smoldering between them either consumed them entirely or forged them into something new, something that could survive the heat. The storm was coming. Everyone in Savannah Creek could feel it in the air, in the strange stillness that settled over the estate that night. The slaves felt it in their quarters, stirring restlessly in their sleep. Silas felt it in the overseer's house, planning his next move with predatory patience. And in their separate spaces, Clara in her bedroom, Isaiah in the forge, 2 people felt it most of all. The electric charge of change approaching, inevitable and terrifying and necessary. By Friday, one way or another, everything would be different. The question was whether either of them would survive to see it. Chapter 5. The next morning, Clara woke to find Prudence already in her room, laying out clothes for the day. The slave woman's face was troubled, and she kept glancing at Clara with poorly concealed anxiety. "What is it, Prudence?" Clara asked, though she could guess the answer. "Your father's in a mood, Miss Clara. Been in his study since before dawn with Silas. They're planning something." Prudence moved closer, lowering her voice. "Word in the kitchen is that Silas has been asking questions. About you, about your activities." So it was beginning. The net closing in. Clara's heart raced, but she forced her expression to remain calm. "What kind of questions? Where you go, what you do, who you talk to?" "Miss Clara," Prudence hesitated, then seemed to reach a decision. "Whatever you're thinking of doing, do it soon. Don't wait. That man's got the scent of something, and he won't let go until he's got you." Clara looked at her maid, really looked at her, seeing perhaps for the first time the keen intelligence in Prudence's eyes, the understanding that came from years of watching white people's dramas unfold while pretending not to notice. "How long have you known?" Clara asked quietly. "Since the first time you went to that forge with stars in your eyes and came back looking like you'd seen the face of God." Prudence smiled sadly. "I've been where you are, Miss Clara. Different man, different circumstances, but the same look, that look that says you'd burn the whole world down for one person." "What happened to him? Your man?" Prudence's face closed off. "He tried to run, got caught, made an example of." She touched Clara's hand briefly. "Don't make his mistake, Miss Clara. If you're going to run, be smarter about it. Be ruthless. Don't look back, don't hesitate, and for God's sake, don't trust anyone you don't have to." The advice was harsh, but sincere. Clara squeezed Prudence's hand in thanks, then allowed herself to be dressed for breakfast. She had to get a message to Isaiah, had to move their timeline up even further. If Silas was actively investigating, they couldn't afford to wait even 4 days. They needed to go tonight. The realization sent a jolt of terror and exhilaration through her. Tonight. In less than 12 hours, she would either be beginning a new life or facing the consequences of the most reckless decision she'd ever made. Breakfast was tense. Her father barely acknowledged her, deep in conversation with Silas about security measures for Thornton's visit. Her mother picked at her food and kept shooting worried glances at Clara. The whole household seemed to vibrate with tension, as if everyone could sense the coming storm, but no one knew exactly what form it would take. Clara forced herself to eat, to appear normal, to give no indication of the plans churning in her mind. After breakfast, she excused herself to visit the garden, a daily routine that wouldn't raise suspicion. Once outside, she made her way carefully toward the forge, taking a circuitous route that kept her out of sight of the main house. Isaiah was working when she slipped inside, and his eyes widened in alarm when he saw her. "Clara, Silas was here 20 minutes ago. He's watching everything. I know. That's why we need to go tonight." Isaiah's hammer paused mid-swing. "Tonight? We're not ready. The supplies, the route planning, we don't have a choice." Clara quickly explained about Thornton's early arrival, about Silas's investigation, about Prudence's warning. "If we wait any longer, they'll make it impossible. Tonight is our only chance." Isaiah set down his tools with deliberate care, his mind clearly racing through scenarios. "All right, tonight, but we'll need help. Moses can—" The forge door swung open and both of them froze. But it wasn't Silas this time. It was Elizabeth Harrison, Clara's mother, standing in the doorway like a ghost in her pale mourning dress. "Mama," Clara began, but her mother held up a hand. "Don't," Elizabeth said quietly. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her, her movements careful and deliberate. "Don't insult me by pretending. I've known for days what was happening. I've been waiting to see if you would come to your senses." Clara's heart sank. "Are you here to stop us?" Her mother looked at Isaiah for a long moment, studying him with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably. Then she turned back to Clara. "Do you love him?" The question hung in the air. Clara could lie, could deflect, could try to protect Isaiah by denying everything. But she was tired of lies. "Yes." "And you?" Elizabeth looked at Isaiah. "Do you love my daughter?" Isaiah met her gaze steadily. "More than my life, ma'am." Elizabeth nodded slowly, as if confirming something she already knew. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small velvet bag, heavy with coins. "Take this," she said, handing it to Clara. "It's everything I've managed to save over the years. It should be enough to get you to Pennsylvania, maybe even to New York if you're careful." Clara stared at the bag, then at her mother, unable to process what was happening. "Mama, I don't understand." "Why would you help us?" Her mother's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Because 30 years ago I was you, in love with someone impossible, planning to run away. But I was a coward, Clara. When the moment came to choose, I chose safety over love. I chose your father's wealth and position over the man who made me feel alive." "The man you mentioned before," Clara whispered. "What happened to him?" "He ran without me. Got caught at the Tennessee border. They hanged him as a warning to other slaves who might get ideas about freedom." Elizabeth's voice cracked. "And I've lived with that every day since, wondering what might have been if I'd been brave enough, if I'd loved him enough to risk everything." She cupped Clara's face in her hands. "Don't make my mistake, daughter. Don't spend the rest of your life wondering. If you love this man, if he loves you, then go. Run as far and as fast as you can, and don't ever look back." Clara was crying now, holding her mother close. Come with us, please. You don't have to stay in this prison either." But Elizabeth shook her head. "It's too late for me. I made my choice long ago, and I have to live with it. But you still have a chance. Take it." She pulled back, brushing tears from Clara's cheeks. "There's a wagon leaving for Marietta at midnight. Medical supplies for the hospital there. The driver is a man named Thomas Webb, and he owes me a favor. He'll hide you in the back, get you past the county line. After that, you're on your own." She turned to Isaiah. "Take care of her. Keep her safe. Make sure my cowardice doesn't ruin 2 generations." "I will, ma'am," Isaiah said, his voice thick with emotion. "I swear it." Elizabeth moved to the door, then paused. "You have until midnight. After that, I can't protect you anymore. Your father will discover you're gone by morning, and he'll send every slave catcher in Georgia after you." She looked back at them one last time. "Make it count. Make it worth everything you're giving up." Then she was gone, leaving Clara and Isaiah alone in the forge with a bag of coins and 11 hours until escape. They stared at each other in stunned silence. "Your mother," Isaiah finally said. "I didn't expect, neither did I." Clara looked down at the velvet bag in her hands, feeling the weight of her mother's sacrifice, her mother's regret, her mother's hope. "We can't waste this. We have to use every minute we have to prepare." They spent the next hour planning in urgent whispers. Isaiah would gather what supplies he could from the forge: a knife, flint and steel, a small hammer that could serve as a weapon if needed. Clara would return to the house and pack only the essentials: sturdy clothes, food that wouldn't spoil, her mother's jewelry for selling once they reached free territory. "What about Moses?" Clara asked. "Can we trust him?" "With my life," Isaiah said. "He already knows. He's been helping me prepare for when we ran. I'll get word to him about the timeline change. He'll make sure Silas is occupied tonight, that there are no unexpected patrols." They synchronized their plans one more time. Then Clara slipped back to the main house, her mind racing. She had 11 hours. 11 hours to say goodbye to everything she'd ever known, to pack a life into a single bag, to prepare for a journey that would either end in freedom or death. The afternoon dragged by with agonizing slowness. Clara went through the motions of her daily routine: lunch with her mother, needlework in the parlor, a walk through the gardens. Every minute felt like an hour. Every glance from her father made her heart race with fear that he somehow knew. But Mayor Harrison was preoccupied with preparations for Thornton's arrival, too absorbed in his political maneuvering to notice his daughter's distraction. He didn't see her slip upstairs early, claiming a headache. He didn't notice when she began discreetly packing a small bag with practical clothes instead of the elaborate dresses he'd bought to impress suitors. At dinner, Clara barely tasted her food. She studied her parents across the table, memorizing their faces. Her father, stern and ambitious, who'd never really seen her as anything more than a political asset. Her mother, tragic and brave, who'd given up her own chance at happiness but refused to let her daughter do the same. "You're very quiet tonight," her father observed. "Are you feeling well?" "Just thinking about Mr. Thornton's visit," Clara lied smoothly. "Nervous, I suppose." "No need to be nervous. Thornton's a good man, a good match. You'll be settled and comfortable. It's everything a woman could want." Clara smiled and said nothing. Let him believe she'd accepted her fate. Let him think he'd won. It would make tonight's departure easier. After dinner, she retreated to her room. Prudence came to help her undress, and when they were alone, Clara pressed a note into her hand. "Don't read this until morning," she whispered, "and when they ask, tell them you knew nothing." Prudence looked at the note, then at Clara, and nodded silently. She hugged Clara briefly, an impropriety that would have shocked any observer, but they were past proprieties now. Then she left, closing the door softly behind her. Clara changed into traveling clothes, a simple, dark dress, sturdy boots, a cloak against the night chill. She packed the bag with shaking hands, food wrapped in cloth, a canteen for water, a change of clothes, her mother's jewelry. The velvet bag of coins went into a hidden pocket she'd sewn into her dress. At 11 o'clock, she heard her parents retire to their rooms. The house settled into quiet. Clara waited by her window, watching the grounds below, her heart pounding so hard she was sure it could be heard throughout the house. At 1:45, she saw a figure emerge from the forge Isaiah, moving silently through the shadows toward the designated meeting point behind the stables. Clara picked up her bag, took one last look at her room, at the bed she'd slept in since childhood, the desk where she'd written countless letters, the window where she'd dreamed of a different life, and slipped out into the hallway. The house was dark and quiet. Clara moved like a ghost through familiar spaces, avoiding the creaky floorboards she'd learned over years of midnight wanderings. She made it down the stairs, through the kitchen, out the back door without incident. The night air was cool and thick with the smell of jasmine from the gardens. Clara hurried toward the meeting point, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. She found Isaiah waiting beside an old oak tree, his own bag slung over his shoulder. "Ready," he whispered. Clara took his hand, the first time they'd touched openly, without fear of being seen. "Ready." They moved quickly through the grounds, skirting the slave quarters where Moses had promised to keep watch. As they passed, Clara saw a figure standing in the doorway of one of the cabins, Moses raising a hand in silent farewell. Isaiah nodded back, a wordless exchange of brotherhood and goodbye. The wagon waited at the edge of the estate, on a service road rarely used after dark. Thomas Webb, a weathered man in his 50s with kind eyes, nodded when he saw them. "Mrs. Harrison said you'd be coming," he said quietly. "Get in the back under the canvas. There's a space hollowed out among the crates. Should be enough air to breathe, but it'll be cramped." He helped them climb into the wagon bed, showed them the narrow space between crates of medical supplies. It was tight, claustrophobic, barely enough room for 2 people, but it would have to do. "Once we're past the county line, I'll let you out," Webb said. "After that, you're on your own. Head northwest toward the mountains. There's a farmhouse about 30 miles from where I'll leave you, White House, with blue shutters, owned by a man named Micah Lawson. Tell him Thomas sent you. He'll help you get farther north." "Thank you," Clara said, and Webb just nodded. "Thank your mother. Woman's been carrying a broken heart for 30 years. Glad to see at least one story might have a different ending." He pulled the canvas over them, plunging them into darkness. Clara heard him climbing into the driver's seat, heard the crack of reins, felt the wagon lurch into motion. In the cramped space, pressed against Isaiah's side, Clara felt the magnitude of what they'd done wash over her. There was no going back now. The wagon was moving, carrying them away from everything they'd known, toward an uncertain future. Isaiah's hand found hers in the darkness and squeezed. "Second thoughts?" he whispered. "Not one," Clara whispered back. The wagon rumbled through the night. Above them, hidden by canvas and crates, the stars wheeled through their ancient patterns. Behind them, the Harrison estate slept, unaware that by morning nothing would be the same. In his bed, Mayor Thomas Harrison dreamed of political triumph, of his daughter's wedding to William Thornton, of the power and influence that alliance would bring. He didn't know that his daughter was already miles away, that his carefully constructed plans were unraveling with every turn of the wagon wheels. In her room, Elizabeth Harrison lay awake, listening to the sounds of the night, hoping her daughter had made it safely to the wagon. She thought of the man she'd loved and lost 30 years ago, of all the might-have-beens that haunted her, and she prayed for the first time in years. She truly prayed that Clara and Isaiah would find what she'd been too afraid to reach for. In the slave quarters, Moses stood watch at his window, making sure no one stirred who might notice the wagon leaving. He thought about Isaiah, about freedom, about the courage it took to risk everything for a chance at something better. When the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hint of dawn, he finally allowed himself to sleep, knowing his friend had made it at least this far. And in the overseer's house, Silas Drummond woke from a restless sleep with the sudden conviction that something was wrong. He rose, dressed quickly, and headed out to begin his morning rounds. He walked past the forge, noting that no smoke rose from the chimney despite the early hour. Isaiah was usually up before dawn, always first to start the day's work. Silas walked faster, his instincts screaming danger. He reached the cabin where Isaiah slept and threw open the door without knocking. The bed was empty. The few possessions Isaiah owned were gone. Silas ran to the main house, taking the stairs two at a time, pounding on Mayor Harrison's bedroom door hard enough to rattle the frame. "Sir, sir, wake up! The forge slave, he's gone. Ran during the night." Inside the room, Mayor Harrison jerked awake, his mind struggling to process the news. A runaway slave was serious, but not unprecedented. They'd send trackers, dogs, would have him back within days, would make such an example of him that no one else would dare try. But then another thought struck him, sudden and terrible. He pulled on his robe and strode down the hallway to Clara's room, Silas following close behind. He knocked sharply. No answer. He knocked again, harder, nothing. Mayor Harrison threw open the door to find the room empty, the bed neatly made, a note propped on the pillow. His hands shook as he unfolded it, reading the words that destroyed his world in a single stroke. "Father, by the time you read this, I will be gone. I'm sorry for the pain this will cause you and Mother, but I cannot live the life you've planned for me. I'm choosing freedom over security, love over duty, my own happiness over your political ambitions. Don't try to find me. Don't send anyone after us. The scandal of a daughter who ran away with a slave will be damaging enough. A manhunt will only make it worse. Tell everyone I eloped with someone unsuitable, that I've gone north to live in disgrace. It will be easier for everyone. I hope someday you might understand why I had to do this, but even if you never do, I want you to know. I regret nothing. For the first time in my life, I'm truly free." Clara Mayer Harrison read the letter 3 times, each reading making the reality sink deeper. His daughter, his only child, had destroyed them all. The scandal would be catastrophic. His political career, his social standing, his family's reputation, all of it gone in one reckless act of rebellion. "Get Samuel Pike," he said, his voice deadly calm. "Get every tracker, every slave catcher within 100 miles. I want them found. I want them brought back. And I want that slave to pay for this with every ounce of suffering we can devise." "Yes, sir," Silas said, and there was unholy glee in his voice. This was what he'd been waiting for, proof of what he'd suspected, vindication of his surveillance. "I'll have men on their trail within the hour." But even as they mobilized, even as riders were sent out in every direction, even as dogs were brought in to track the fugitive's scent, Clara and Isaiah were already 30 miles away, hidden in Thomas Webb's farmhouse, preparing for the next leg of their journey. They'd gained a night's head start. Whether it would be enough remained to be seen. The hunt had begun. Chapter 6. The first week of their flight was a nightmare of constant motion and paranoid vigilance. Thomas Webb had delivered them to Micah Lawson's farmhouse as promised, and from there they'd been passed like precious contraband through a network of sympathizers and former slaves, each safe house bringing them closer to free territory, but never quite close enough. Clara learned quickly that her privileged upbringing had left her utterly unprepared for the realities of running for your life. The first night in Micah Lawson's barn, she'd stared in disbelief at the meager supper of hard bread and weak soup, her stomach growling with hunger she'd never truly known before. Isaiah had watched her struggle with something like pity and something like admiration. "You can still turn back," he'd said quietly. "Claim you were kidnapped, that I forced you. They might believe it. You could go home." Clara had looked at him exhausted, frightened, but determined, and shook her head. "This is home now. Wherever you are, that's home." They'd traveled mostly at night, sleeping in barns and root cellars during the day. Micah had provided them with papers, forged documents claiming Clara was the widow of a merchant and Isaiah was her manservant, traveling north to settle her late husband's affairs. The papers were decent enough to pass casual inspection, but they wouldn't hold up to serious scrutiny. On the third night, they'd heard dogs in the distance and had to change course, abandoning the planned route for a more circuitous path through rough mountain terrain. Clara's feet blistered in her boots, unused to such sustained walking. Isaiah had wanted to stop, to let her rest, but they couldn't afford to. Every hour they delayed was an hour the trackers gained. By the fifth day, they'd made it to the Tennessee border, staying with a Quaker family who'd helped dozens of runaways over the years. The wife, a stern woman named Judith, had tended to Clara's feet and given them both new clothes rougher, more worn, the kind enslaved people and poor whites would wear. Clara's fine dress and cloak were burned in the fireplace, erasing one more connection to her former life. "You're learning," Judith had said approvingly, watching Clara eat beans from a tin plate without complaint. "Lot of privileged folks think they want adventure until they actually get it, but you're adapting. That's good. You'll need that flexibility where you're going." Where they were going, it turned out, was Pennsylvania, then possibly New York, or even Canada. The farther north they got, the safer they'd be, but also the longer they'd have to maintain their deception, live their lie, trust in the fragile papers and hastily constructed cover stories. On the seventh night, they'd nearly been caught. They'd been traveling through a small town in eastern Tennessee, trying to make it to the next safe house before dawn. But they'd misjudged the distance, and sunrise found them still on the road, exposed and visible. A local constable had stopped them, demanding to see their papers. Clara's heart had hammered as she'd presented the forged documents, watching the constable's face for any sign of suspicion. Isaiah had stood silently beside her, eyes downcast, playing the role of subservient slave perfectly. Every muscle in his body had been tensed for flight or fight, though both would have been suicidal. The constable had studied the papers for what felt like an eternity, then looked up at Clara with narrow eyes. "Your manservant there seems mighty well fed for a slave," he'd observed, "and those are fresh clothes he's wearing. Where'd you say you were coming from?" Clara had met his gaze steadily, channeling every ounce of aristocratic hauteur she'd learned from years of her father's political functions. "Savannah, as the papers indicate. My late husband believed in maintaining his property well. Isaiah has been with our family for years, and I see no reason to let him go to seed just because Thomas is deceased." The calculated coldness of her words, referring to Isaiah as property even as they ran toward freedom together, had left a bitter taste, but it had worked. The constable had handed back the papers and waved them through with barely concealed contempt for what he saw as a foolish young widow traveling with an expensive slave she should have sold to settle debts. They'd made it to the safe house, a mill operated by a freed slave named Abraham, and collapsed in exhaustion and relief. That night, in the loft of the mill, Clara had finally broken down, sobbing into Isaiah's chest. "I called you property," she'd gasped between tears. "I'd looked at him and lied about owning you. Isaiah, I'm so sorry." "You saved us," Isaiah had said firmly, holding her close. "Clara, you played the part you needed to play. That's survival. That's what we have to do until we reach free territory." It felt like betraying everything we're running for. The only betrayal would be getting caught and ending up right back where we started, or worse. He'd tilted her face up to look at him. "You did good today. You kept us alive. That's what matters." Now, 11 days after leaving Savannah Creek, they were somewhere in Virginia, holed up in the attic of a Presbyterian minister who'd been helping runaways for a decade. Reverend Matthews, no relation to the Savannah Creek clergyman, had informed them that their pursuers were close. Mayor Harrison had put up a reward of $500 for information leading to their capture. $500 was enough to make even sympathetic people think twice about helping. "You need to move fast," the Reverend had said. Get to Pennsylvania within the next 3 days, or you'll be caught. The slave catchers are organized, well-funded, and motivated. That's a lot of money your father's offering." So they'd rested for a day, gathering their strength for the final push. Clara had used the time to write a letter, not to her father, but to her mother, knowing it would likely never be sent, but needing to say the words anyway. "Mama, we're alive, we're together, and we're almost free. I think of you every day, of your sacrifice, of your courage in helping us. I hope you're not suffering too much from Father's rage. You were right about Isaiah. He's strong and kind and resourceful in ways I never imagined. He keeps me going when I want to quit. He makes me laugh even when we're exhausted and scared. He really sees me in a way no one ever has. I miss you. I miss our morning walks in the garden, our quiet conversations when Father wasn't around. But I don't regret leaving. Every hardship we've faced has been worth it for the moments of freedom we've stolen. I hope you find peace, Mama. I hope you can forgive yourself for the choice you made 30 years ago. I hope knowing that you gave your daughter a different ending brings you some measure of comfort. With all my love, Clara." She'd folded the letter carefully and tucked it away. Someday, maybe, she'd find a way to send it. Or maybe it would just be a record, proof that this journey had happened, that their impossible love was real. On their 13th night of running, they crossed into Pennsylvania. Isaiah felt it the moment they crossed the border, not any physical change, but something deeper, something almost spiritual. They were standing on free soil. Here, at least in theory, he was a man, not property. Here, Clara wasn't committing a crime by loving him. They stood at the border marker in the pre-dawn darkness, holding hands, both of them crying without shame. "We made it," Clara whispered. "Isaiah, we actually made it." But even as the words left her mouth, they heard the sounds that shattered their celebration. Dogs baying in the distance, growing closer, voices shouting. The slave catchers had caught up to them at the worst possible moment, right at the threshold of freedom. "Run!" Isaiah said, pulling her forward. "Clara, run!" They crashed through the underbrush, Pennsylvania forest closing around them. Clara's feet screamed in protest, her lungs burning, but she forced herself to keep moving. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. The dogs, the men, the inevitability of capture pressing down like a physical weight. They burst out of the trees into a clearing, and Clara's hope died. Ahead of them was a cliff face, a sheer drop of at least 50 feet into a rocky ravine below. Behind them, the slave catchers emerged from the forest, 5 men with rifles and dogs, led by a hard-faced tracker named Eli Sutton, who specialized in this kind of hunt. "End of the line," Sutton called out. "Girl, step away from the nigger. Your daddy's offering good money to bring you home safe. But him," he gestured at Isaiah with his rifle, "we just need to bring him back breathing. Anything beyond that is optional." Clara moved closer to Isaiah instead of away, taking his hand. "We're not going back. Miss, you got 2 choices. Come willing and keep your dignity, or we take you by force and you arrive home roughed up and shamed. Your choice." "There's a 3rd choice," Clara said, and she looked at Isaiah, seeing in his eyes that he understood. She squeezed his hand. "Together. Always," he said. Before Sutton could react, before anyone could stop them, Clara and Isaiah ran toward the cliff edge. For a moment, time seemed to suspend, the catchers shouting, the dogs barking, the world holding its breath. Then they were airborne, falling through space, hands still clasped together. Clara felt wind rushing past, felt Isaiah's grip tighten on hers, felt an odd sense of peace settle over her. If this was the end, at least it was their choice. At least they'd die free. They hit the water hard. Clara had forgotten there was a river at the bottom of the ravine. She'd been too focused on the cliff, on the drop, on making a final choice before that choice was taken from them. The impact drove the breath from her lungs, the cold water shocking her system. She lost her grip on Isaiah's hand, tumbled under the current, fought her way back to the surface, gasping. "Isaiah!" She spun in the water, searching frantically. Isaiah! He surfaced 10 feet downstream, coughing and sputtering. Here, I'm here. The current was strong, pulling them both downstream away from the cliff. Clara heard gunshots above Sutton and his men firing wildly into the water, but the distance and the river's speed made them poor targets. She and Isaiah let the current take them, swimming only enough to keep their heads above water, letting the river carry them away from their pursuers. They floated for a quarter-mile before the river calmed enough to swim for shore. Clara dragged herself onto the bank, every muscle screaming, her clothes sodden and heavy. Isaiah collapsed beside her, both of them too exhausted to move. "Did we die?" Clara asked when she could finally speak. "Is this heaven?" Isaiah laughed, a sound edged with hysteria. "If this is heaven, it's cold and wet and I still hurt everywhere." They lay there for a long moment, catching their breath, listening for sounds of pursuit. But the river had carried them out of sight of the cliff, and Sutton's men would have to backtrack miles to find a way down into the ravine. By then, Clara and Isaiah would be long gone. When they finally sat up, Isaiah cupped Clara's face in his hands, studying her intently. "You're insane," he said. "Jumping off a cliff, that was your plan. Better than going back in chains. We could have died. We could have lived in separate hells." Clara kissed him, tasting river water and blood where she'd bitten her lip in the fall. "I'd rather die free with you than live enslaved without you." Isaiah pulled her close, and they sat there in the Pennsylvania dawn, battered and soaked and alive, having crossed not just a border but a threshold. They'd gambled everything on an impossible love and somehow miraculously won, but their victory was far from complete. Over the next 3 weeks, they made their way slowly north, working odd jobs for food, sleeping in barns and abandoned buildings, always moving, always wary. The $500 reward was still active, and slave catchers didn't respect border lines. Until they reached a major city where they could disappear into the crowds, they were still vulnerable. They found work on a farm outside Philadelphia, Isaiah as a blacksmith, Clara as a house servant. The farm owner, a Quaker named Benjamin Morton, asked no questions about their past, required no papers beyond the forged documents. He paid fair wages and looked the other way when Clara and Isaiah shared the small cabin behind the forge. For the first time since leaving Savannah Creek, they could breathe. For the first time, they could explore what it meant to be together without fear of discovery, without the weight of impossible circumstances crushing them. They were married in September by a circuit preacher who served the local free black community. It was a simple ceremony, no white dress, no elaborate reception, none of the trappings that Clara's father would have demanded. Just Clara and Isaiah, standing before God and a small gathering of friends they'd made in their new community, promising themselves to each other freely. Moses would have been proud, Clara thought, during the ceremony. Her mother would have cried. Even Prudence, pragmatic Prudence, would have allowed herself a moment of happiness for them, but none of them were there. None of them would ever know if this story had a happy ending. That first winter in Pennsylvania was hard. The cabin was drafty, the work was exhausting, and some nights they went to bed hungry because they couldn't afford enough food. Clara's hands, once soft and cared for, became calloused and rough. Isaiah's body still bore the scars from his whipping, a permanent reminder of the system they'd escaped. But they were happy. Despite everything, despite the hardship and the uncertainty and the constant low-level fear that someday, somehow, they'd be found and dragged back, they were happier than either had ever imagined being. On Christmas Eve, as they sat by the fire in their small cabin, Clara rested her head on Isaiah's shoulder. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Leaving? Running? Everything we gave up?" Isaiah was silent for a moment, considering. "I regret the pain we caused people we cared about. I regret that Moses and the others might have suffered because of our escape. I regret that your mother had to lie to your father to protect us." He tightened his arm around her. But do I regret choosing you, choosing freedom? Not for a single second. Even though we're poor, even though you work 14-hour days and we can barely afford heating fuel. Clara, I spent 25 years as another man's property. I spent every day knowing that anything I created, any skill I developed, any small joy I found could be taken away at someone else's whim. Now I work 14-hour days, yes, but I work for myself, for us. Every nail I forge, every gate hinge I make, it's mine. That's worth any amount of hardship. Clara nodded against his shoulder. My father probably told everyone I was dead, or ruined beyond redemption. My mother is probably a widow in all but name, shut away from society because of the scandal I created. Do you wish you'd made a different choice? Clara thought about William Thornton, about the life she'd have had as his wife. Thought about the comfortable cage her father had built for her, about the slow suffocation of living according to others' expectations. Thought about never knowing Isaiah, never feeling this bone-deep sense of rightness when he held her. No, she said firmly, I'd make the same choice again, every single time. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire crackle. Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing the world in white. In Savannah Creek, Georgia, the Harrison estate still stood, but its glory days were over. Mayor Thomas Harrison's political career had imploded in the scandal of his daughter's defection. He'd lost his bid for state senate, lost most of his social standing, and spent a fortune on slave catchers who never brought Clara back. The estate was hemorrhaging money, and rumors swirled that he'd have to sell land to cover his debts. Elizabeth Harrison moved through the manor like a ghost, playing the role of tragic mother publicly, while privately cherishing the letter that had arrived mysteriously 3 months after Clara's escape. No return address, posted from Philadelphia, brief but precious. We're alive and well and happy. Thank you for everything. I hope you find peace. She'd burned the letter immediately, as was safest, but she carried its words in her heart. Her daughter was free. Her daughter was happy. The sacrifice had been worth it. In the slave quarters, Moses had been sold to a plantation in Mississippi, punished for his suspected role in Isaiah's escape. But before he left, he'd spread the story quietly, carefully, in whispered conversations that the overseers couldn't quite stamp out. The story of Isaiah and Clara, of impossible love that conquered impossible odds. The story became legend, proof that the system could be beaten, that freedom was possible, that love mattered. In the north, as winter turned to spring and spring to summer, Clara and Isaiah built their life one day at a time. Isaiah's reputation as a skilled blacksmith grew, bringing more work, more income, more stability. Clara learned to cook and clean and manage their small household, skills that would have been unthinkable for Mayor Harrison's daughter, but were essential for Mrs. Isaiah Freeman, the name she'd taken, creating a new identity to match her new life. By their first anniversary, they'd saved enough to move to Philadelphia proper, to a small house in a neighborhood of free blacks and progressive whites. Isaiah opened his own forge. Clara started teaching literacy to the children of escaped slaves, passing on the education her privilege had afforded her. They had children, 2 daughters and a son, born over the next 8 years. The children grew up hearing their parents' story, learning from an early age that freedom was worth fighting for, that love could conquer even the most entrenched evil, that courage meant choosing the right path, even when it was the hardest one. On quiet nights, when the children were asleep and the forge was cold, Clara and Isaiah would sit on their porch, holding hands, watching the stars. And sometimes Clara would think about the girl she'd been privileged, naive, trapped in a world of silk and silver that had nearly suffocated her. And sometimes Isaiah would touch the scars on his back, remembering the price he'd paid for daring to love someone the world said was forbidden to him. But mostly, they just held each other and marveled at what they'd built together, a life, a family. A future that neither of them had believed possible on that June day in 1851, when Clara had first walked into a forge behind the stables and seen a man who would change everything. In Savannah Creek, people told the story of the Harrison scandal with a mixture of horror and fascination. The mayor's daughter who'd run off with a slave, disgracing her family, ruining her father's career. Some said they'd been caught and executed as an example. Some said they'd died trying to cross into free territory. Some said they'd made it north, but died in poverty and disgrace. No one told the truth, that Clara and Isaiah Freeman lived in Philadelphia, respected members of their community, happy in a way that defied easy explanation, that their love, the profane affair that had shocked Savannah Creek, had been strong enough not just to survive, but to thrive, to create something beautiful out of the ashes of the old world they'd burned down. Because some truths are too dangerous for the establishment to acknowledge. Some love stories are too revolutionary to be told honestly in places where the system that tried to destroy them still holds power. But in the North, in the communities of free people who understood what it meant to fight for your humanity, the story was told differently. There, it was a victory. There, it was proof that the so-called natural order of things was neither natural nor inevitable. There, it was hope. And on the porch of a small house in Philadelphia, as the summer of 1859 deepened toward fall, Clara and Isaiah Freeman sat together in the gathering dusk, their children playing in the yard before them, their forge still warm from the day's work, their life imperfect and sometimes difficult, but undeniably their own stretching out before them like a promise finally kept. "Do you ever miss it?" Isaiah asked, as he sometimes did. "The comfort, the ease?" Clara smiled and squeezed his hand. "Not even for a second. I'd choose this life, our life, over that gilded cage any day." Isaiah raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "What do you think they say about us back in Georgia? Probably that we're dead, or damned, or both." "And what's the truth?" Clara leaned her head on his shoulder, watching their daughters chase fireflies in the twilight, listening to their son's laughter as he played. "The truth is that we're alive, we're free, and we're together. That's all that matters." As darkness fell over Philadelphia, the Freeman house glowed with lamplight and the sound of family. And if you'd been there that night, if you'd looked closely, you might have seen something remarkable. Two people who'd been told they couldn't exist together, shouldn't love each other, had no right to happiness, proving every single day that love, real love, chosen freely, was stronger than any system designed to destroy it. They called it blasphemy. History would remember it as revolution, but for Clara and Isaiah Freeman, it was simply love, and that, in the end, was everything.